Hi everyone, I'm Ida. It's nice to meet you. Just to get started, I'll share a little bit about what I do. Like Rachel said, I'm a journalist and my work has appeared in a lot of platforms she named. I also have recently started dabbling in a lot more multimedia work like audio, video, and photography. Not that I have been doing photography, but more collaborations. I also write hashtag emotional poetry because I am a sad girl at heart. Um, sorry. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of some of my work, I wanted to highlight a few of my favorite pieces. One piece that I feel like doesn't get enough attention, that is maybe one of my favorite essays I've ever written, is this essay for Vice about how social media impacts our memories. It came out in the print magazine, I think in 2018, 19, if I'm saying that correctly. And it was a reflection on how the stories feature on Instagram and other apps actually created, like, mechanically and scientifically, issues with our ability to remember things long term. So a super synopsis, but essentially, like, when we record something, it takes us out of the moment and it offloads the memory onto our device instead of having us record it in our own brains. And yeah, I don't know, I personally found that I had more trouble remembering things after stories were introduced, and I really wanted to explore that in this piece. And crazy enough, there was science behind that. So that's something that's one of my favorite pieces if you all ever want to check that out. Another piece is this feature for Complex about essentially like the role of humans in our new technological music landscape. Right now, we live in a world that's so driven by algorithms and technology in terms of our music discovery and how we engage with music, what we listen to and why we listen to it. And so this piece really explored, what does the future look like in terms of the human touch? Is it important? Is it something that's going to stay? Or is it something that's going to fade away and dissipate with ever increasing technology? The third piece that I'd like to share with you all is another Vice essay about navigating kind of like the racial binary in America, especially as an Asian person. This is one of the first pieces I really intensely wrote that was focused on Asian American identity in particular. And this one just is really special to me because I worked with a really thoughtful editor in putting this together and got to speak to some amazing scholars and experts in the field. But this was one of the first times that I really was able to understand both the diversity of what it means to be Asian American and synthesize that for others to understand in an essay through my writing. And so it's a really challenging thing to do, especially when you have limited words and you are messing with like really like intricate, complex ideas. But this one was really special to me because of that. So if you haven't checked that out, I definitely encourage you to. And speaking of being Asian American, I'd like to dive a little bit more into my writing since then around Asian American identity, especially in light of the rise in anti-Asian violence over the last 2 years after increased xenophobia from COVID-19. One piece that I wanted to highlight was this feature for KQED that's about creating Asian safety, and the importance of community in doing that. I lived in the Bay Area for a long time. I went to UC Berkeley and I stayed in East Bay for a few years after that. So I think I spent a total of 7 years there. And the Bay Area holds a really special place in my heart because the community there is unlike any other I've ever experienced, especially the artistic community, and the communities of color, and kind of seeing the rise in violence that's been happening in that space this year has really been hard for me to interact with and engage with. And this piece was really like a nice way for me to process that, I think, because it highlights the efforts that local organizers have really been involved in over the years, you know, even before this rise in violence, in creating safety for our communities, and how that's going to continue to happen, whether or not the national focus is on making our community safer or not. I also recently released a photo series for IED that is localized to New York. It highlighted a series of New York creatives, Asian American creatives, that are all doing really, really incredible things. And specifically for this piece, I worked with the photographer Alexander to craft a story around the resilience of the space in New York City, and its relationship to the Asian American community at large and what that looks like. So as you can kind of see in the intro here, I really rooted, I would say, the piece in the space of New York's Chinatown, having that be like a localized hub of Asian culture, of Chinese culture especially, and how spaces like that are really important in this time when they feel targeted or can feel attacked, and why it is so important that we honor them and give them the creds that like they deserve, essentially. So that was a really, really awesome thing to put together, because I lived in New York, I would say, for about 8 months. I moved there in September 2019 and left in COVID. I'm not proud of it, but yeah, the city was a really interesting and fascinating place to be for that time. And most recently, I released this piece for paper, for APAM. And this was a series that I actually creative directed and concepted, from the jump with the art director. And it's called The Honor of Being Us. It came for me from a place of being really kind of tired of seeing the way Asian Americans and Asian American identity was kind of represented at mainstream or corporate scales. So I think because Asian identity has become such a big part of the national conversation in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more representation in terms of like celebrating 8pm or featuring Asian artists. And to me, like, a lot of that can be sticky or can err into performativism. And this was a project that I felt very strongly about, where I just wanted to make something that was independent of all of that and simply celebrated who we are as we are and nothing else. And in addition to that, I wanted to highlight in whatever ways that I could the sheer diversity of the Asian American community, given that Asia, you know, as I said in the intro there, spans 48 countries, 2,300 languages, massive wealth and socioeconomic differences, as well as color differences. And so knowing all of that, it was just really important to me to make something that showed the actual diversity of our community and our traditions and cultures. And that was recently released, so definitely easy to find. But on the topic of representation, I touched on this a little bit. I think it's really important as an Asian American to speak to media representation and how much our community has advocated for that over the last, I don't know, 2 decades maybe. I think a big focus of Asian American activism, at least mainstream activism, has been increased representation of Asians, whether that's in the media, whether that's like at the corporate level, in leadership, and in different arts and different fields, whatever that may be. And I do think like representation of our people is definitely important, because you want to see the possibilities of what Asian folks can do in America, for instance. But I just wanted to definitely shed light on the fact that representation is not the end all be all goal. And I think that especially when it's a heightened time for the community and there's so much violence, there's so much infrastructure that's lacking, there's so many vulnerable communities within the Asian American communities that we haven't even kind of like really cared for or found the infrastructure to support, I feel like representation is something that is hard for me to focus on. And I have the works that I've, written here in the past where I have focused on representation. But I think more and more lately, I'm realizing the importance of broadening our conversation beyond that. And so I just want to call that out and show that it's all a journey and we are all just continuing on it. So beyond kind of like magazines and publications, I wanted today to give you all some ideas for projects that words can help you create. Because I think that a lot of folks have kind of limited ideas of what writing can be. Like, it's like, oh yeah, like fill out this page, or like, oh, I've already made a design. Can you just write the words in? Or like the photos are shot. Can you just write the essay? And I think that as a writer, I really struggle with being in spaces like that because I think that words are so deeply important and we have to be so careful with them, so thoughtful and so intentional. And at the end of the day, they end up shaping the project. And having that approach can ultimately change your project so much and elevate the things that you work on to the next level. So that was what I wanted to share in this area. Saving Face is the first project I'd like to speak to. It's a new podcast that I created with New Fly Magazine, which is a magazine, a Bay Area-based magazine that's dedicated to arts and mental health. And this particular podcast is dedicated to breaking the stigma around sharing hard to tell stories. The concept that inspired it was actually this phrase that kept like floating around in my head for I think a few months, and it was like, I am not losing face. And I was like thinking a lot about my own family and my own dynamic with my father and my mother and how weird things were in my family growing up and certain traumas that I had endured. Like I had recently been diagnosed with PTSD, and I was like, oh, like that's so weird that we don't talk about these things, because in Chinese there's this concept called losing face, and you don't want to talk about things like that for fear that you'll bring yourself or your family shame and essentially lose face. And so while I was going through that journey, I just had in my head this phrase. It kept coming up. It was like, I'm not losing face. I'm not losing face. And I was like, why don't I make something around that? And so this podcast was born from that. And I tried to flip the title by calling it Saving Face, so that the act of sharing these stories is actually a reclamation of the concept of saving face. So you are saving face by telling us about your traumas, about your struggles, about anything you were once ashamed of, essentially. And throughout, we interview multiple creatives and get to hear their stories and kind of like dive deeper than the traditional interview. So if you don't mind, I'm going to play the trailer. Welcome to Saving Face, a new podcast dedicated to breaking the stigma around sharing hard-to-tell stories. I'm Ida, and I'll be your host for the series. At its core, this podcast challenges the notion that talking about difficult personal experiences can cause us to lose face, a phenomenon defined as the act of bringing shame to oneself or losing the respect of others. For our first season, we're asking 8 different creatives to dive deep into their past and recount these intense personal stories in a space of openness, honesty, and healing.
I don't really know what happened to the emotional side of things. Like, maybe my parents didn't have time to talk to me about emotions. Maybe, like, they never asked me how I felt about things. And I was like, why don't you just ask me if that made me happy?
I remember just, you'd see lowriders and there'd be people playing music. There's homeless people outside. There's crazy people outside. And shit, there's probably, I don't really know how many gangs there were.
And so I had to have that really difficult, painful conversation with myself and really figure it out. So what do you want? Where do you want to be? Like, what are you doing right now? And why are you unhappy?
Throughout each episode, we'll go beyond the traditional interview to look at the ways these experiences have impacted our guests' work and explore how these stories have made them who they are today. Our first episode launches April 5th, and you can join us for a new story every week.
We hope you'll be there. Until then, take care.
Yes, and Saving Face actually just wrapped up. We finished our season finale this week, so definitely give it a listen if you're interested. Okay, now I'm gonna shift to Instagram. I'm so sorry, everybody. But the first project is Protect Our Elders. Some of you may have seen this floating around Instagram around Lunar New Year. It was a project that my partner Miles and I created from a place that we really wanted to be rooted in solidarity. And we wanted to make a call to action that would incentivize people to not only speak up about what was happening, because at the time I hadn't seen a lot of movement or conversation on social media about the violence, but also provide a list of resources and ways to help, which I felt at that time hadn't been concretely made yet. There was a lot of discourse and dialogue, but unfortunately not a lot of action-oriented things. So that's kind of like what we did here. Miles is a Black designer, and I worked with him on crafting the layout of the whole thing, but especially the first element, which is something I wanted to point out in terms of how words can work with visuals to create a concept. So we have the symbolism, for instance, here of the Chinatown with the lanterns, because at that time, that's where a lot of the attacks were happening. They were localized to Oakland's Chinatown or SF's Chinatown, for instance. And what we put on this poster, we spent so long on. I think we spent like 8 hours straight going back and forth about it. And we wanted a call to action that was clear, but motivational at the same time. And we felt that Protect Our Elders, which is something that I thought of like on a whim when I was seeing kind of like video after video of these attacks, it just stuck with me. And we felt that that was a super strong statement. And so in order to support that, we wanted to kind of like bring the attention to community-oriented action, which is where that Support Our Chinatown, Support Our Communities comes in. And then at the very bottom, we wanted to emphasize that this is a call to action. So if you feel so moved when you see this, like, please do something. Then following that, I created a timeline that essentially aggregated all the attacks that I could find. At that time, I really wanted to emphasize to people the sheer volume of the attacks that were happening. This isn't the complete project, by the way, so there are more slides that I've left out, but I wanted to emphasize to people just how many attacks had occurred in like a 3-week period and how violent some of those were in nature. To really emphasize like the importance of creating action around this. And then finally, like I mentioned, we had the resource page and a list of orgs that folks were able to donate to after that. So that project went super far. It went very viral, which is always interesting. But I think what mattered the most to me is that in addition to spurring a lot more of that social media conversation, and circulating resources because they got reproduced and reproduced by other accounts, this project ended up raising over 150K in just a week. So we only ran our fundraiser for 1 week, and it was crazy how many folks we were able to support. And I think that one of the things that really resonated with me the most after this project was hearing these organizations say, like, oh my God, I have never received this much financial support. Like, nobody has ever seen our name online. Organizations like Mekong, New York City, still are like reposted on resource lists today. And they had never had any kind of online presence. So I'm really, really grateful to this project and what came from it, and the fact that it did create a lot more awareness around this rise in anti-Asian violence, and hopefully some positive impact in terms of resourcing as well. Another project I wanted to highlight was Individualism, the American Way. It was a collaboration with my friend Hedgie, who's a stylist and 3D artist. This project was created out of a space of frustration around America's attitude towards mask wearing. I felt that being Asian, I am in dialogue with Asian people and culture, and I see kind of like the collectivist nature of how Asian folks move. And to me, this individualistic nature of Americans being like, I don't want to wear my mask because I don't have an issue. I don't care if other people get hurt or sick. Really like made me frustrated and kind of messed with how I felt about things at that time. And so this project was made satirically to kind of criticize that. And it was another one of those that went pretty viral on social media. And it was awesome to see people care about mask wearing, because at that moment I felt like nobody did. Another mask project that I created in March 2020 was this collaborative photo project that called attention to the rise in anti-Asian violence in the first wave. So when COVID-19 had first arrived in the United States. I specifically wanted to call out the illogical and kind of like arbitrary nature of these attacks. So if you see in February 1st, the Asian woman is assaulted for wearing a mask, but then on March 10th, then Asian woman is punched in the face for not wearing a mask. So I think it was, to me, an important thing to highlight, because at that time, a lot of folks weren't talking about this on social media yet. And I found that while sharing news articles or screenshots is effective in educating your own immediate circle, when you share art, it actually is able to have a much broader reach, because folks are more willing to share art than share a news article. So that's something really interesting that I've learned throughout all these projects. Going off of that, I think that infographics on Instagram is definitely a thing. I think, yeah, like I would love to open up this dialogue. Maybe we can chat about this in the Q&A if folks have thoughts, but I'd love to hear if you all think, or in the chat too, feel free to drop, thoughts in there. Do you think infographics help? Like, do you trust them? Do you feel like they're trustworthy? Is there thinking about how we do them correctly versus incorrectly? For me, what I found, and as somebody who's released a couple of these, I am guilty. I found that research is really everything. I think that it's super important to cite your sources and to not just reproduce things that you see in a different style, because it's adding noise to the conversation when there's already so much noise on social media. So to me, I think if you feel compelled to create something like this, my advice would be to definitely make sure everything is factually accurate and add something new when you can, because this is a space where we are still navigating how to give or disseminate information on Instagram. And I can say that it's really difficult. I think last in this is just some poetry that I've worked on. I'd love to hear in the chat too, like, what do you consider poetry? What are some of your favorite forms of poetry? I think that we see a lot of short form because of the nature of social media, but I also want to highlight that we can kind of play, for instance, with layout and design and structure and dialogue in order to create more dynamic poetry and prose, whatever that means. Oh yeah, this is another project that I recently released with Culture Strike about what it means to find safe spaces as Asians in America. Okay, so let's write stuff. I have 2 prompts for you all, and they are, you can interpret them however you want. So what we'll do is split out into breakout rooms, and each one is going to have a facilitator. Rachel's going to help us out with that. And you will have 5 minutes to write for each prompt, and then 3 minutes to share if you feel comfortable. It'd be great if you all could introduce yourselves when you share, and yeah, definitely no pressure, but I'd love to see what you all are writing. And we will rotate rooms so that everybody can share. The first prompt is, where do you come from? It's one of my favorite. I love this one, and I hope that you all have fun with it.